I kind of wanted to have you on a little bit selfishly, I guess, because I know following, your YouTube videos and the stuff you've put out with THP and whatnot, a lot of
Mhm.
your style, I think, translates how I kind of want to go about myself this year, at least. I think there's a
Mhm.
lot of guys in the more recent years, after seeing a lot more guys doing it, about hunting on the ground, being super mobile, and not getting tied down to a certain spot. So that's kind of why I wanted to have you on, because you have a lot of experience and been around people that are really good at that. So I wanted to dive a little bit into
Cool.
your style, pick your brain a little bit. So why don't you start giving people background, like where you're located, what kind of
Mhm.
terrain, and how you grew up kind of hunting, and how that's maybe morphed your style currently.
Yeah, for sure. I currently live in southeastern Ohio. I grew up in central Ohio, Knox County, like right on the break of where you hit a little bit more terrain and stuff. But I grew up in slightly flatter ground, kind of hunting more just typical ag country type stuff. And recently, I've been living down here around the Athens area, southeastern Ohio, for 7 or 8 years now, something like that. So I've been hunting a lot more of the typical, just a lot of states have the same similar terrain to this, just smaller hill country, a lot of woods and stuff like that. And yeah, I've just been doing a lot more of that in the past, like I said, 7 or 8 years. In the past 5 years, I'd say probably since in 2020 timeframe, I started doing a lot more ground hunting. Yeah, doing a bunch of hunting with Zach and my brothers as well. And we just kind of started doing that more. I have never really been a great tree stand hunter myself. I'm not super comfortable being in a stand all the time, and kind of just gave me a reason. It's like, oh, I can just be on the ground and just be more mobile, have more fun doing it. I like to move around a lot, and that just helps with that as well. And the more I did ground hunting, still hunting, whatever you really want to call it, the more I just found myself learning a lot more stuff about the woods. And now I just like doing it more than anything, really, for the same reasons. I can stay mobile, but still make really effective setups and not overhunt the same spots. And I even do it on, private and public land, both. It's just, for one, for me, it's super safe. I don't have to get into a tree at all. That saves me a lot of time too. And then, like I said, you can change your setups very minutely instead of just being in the same tree, or being limited to setups like that. So you can shift around a few yards and make your setups more effective. But yeah, I like it a lot. It's been really effective for me too for the past 5 years of doing it. Not to mention way more fun as well, I think.
Sure. Something that kind of makes me think about, like, I can assume without really knowing you that well, fitting your personality. Like, are you kind of like a very impatient person by nature? Just always got to be moving and
I think I have patience in other things. I think I've just done enough of it now to where I've I feel like you learn that you can get away with more movement and that you don't have to limit yourself so much. It's all dependent on timing. We can get into all that stuff, but yeah, patience. I think it's a fine line of, like, when I'm set up for too long, I'm always thinking about, I could be here, I could be there, to where when I'm on the ground, what I'll do a lot of times is just still hunt really slowly until I get to a spot that I'm super confident in, with, like, if it's an evening with like an hour and a half left, and I just set up and it's like, I'm just going here and I'm going to do it for this hour and a half. And if it doesn't work out, maybe I'll hunt the same area in a slightly different spot. And I think that kind of helps with, patience is the one thing that I've been trying to work on more, because you still have to have the patience when you're doing the ground hunting thing and not just ram stuff. So there's still a lot of holding back when you're doing that, but you can you can get away with moving around a lot more, and not have to be too pinned down to where that does make me pretty impatient, I would say.
right. And so it kind of sounds like just your style, whether that's a spot that you have experience with from past years or whatnot. I know at least me, even in a new spot, I'd probably pick two or three different spots that based on a map that maybe I want to hit, just
Mhm.
based on experience, just so you kind of have a plan B, plan C. So you're just still hunting towards one or multiple of those and kind of like checking them off like, oh, it's not not hot here yet. Kind of maybe stage hunt your way back. So that probably depends on the time of year, what you're doing. Maybe just dive a little bit more in depth on that, like stage hunting process, still hunting.
Yeah. So I like hunting in October a lot, like the even in middle of October when a lot of people like the October lull, whatever that even means to different people, but just when the weather's different and deer aren't moving as much, but you still have a lot of cover within the woods and you have deer that are like generally pretty unpressured earlier in the season. And I think that time of year, what I'll do a lot is like if I have a full day, I'll go to a spot in the morning where around here maybe it's like you get up high in the mornings and you just sit there and you kind of let the thermal start to pick up and you get into a high traffic area. Maybe you're on like a scrape or something or a trail that's pinched at the head of a bowl, something like that, and wait for the e-brake. Wait for the thermals to shift to kind of like I notice a lot of times, especially in this type of like topography, like the 9 o'clock time frame in the morning when like the day winds start to pick up past the thermals, you'll get a lot of movement at that time rather than like right off the bat. So I'll sit mornings at a in a decent spot that I feel confident in until maybe 9:30 to 10 o'clock. And then if I have the full day, I'll just do a lot of slow moving through areas that I'm really interested in checking out and just look for sign. Even if you bump deer, like I've been trying to get better about like if you bump deer, you're still learning a lot about that spot and like they're probably not going far, especially in the early season when they got that cover and you can kind of back out of there and still take note of that. But doing a lot more moving around and finding the absolute hottest sign that you can find and then getting back into it when the conditions make sense for it. You know, if you're limited to that day, push in as aggressively as possible to where you're finding the hottest sign and just make your aggressive setup. But even if you have days following, you can plan a couple different ways to check different spots off. Um, that works a lot better for those longer days in October when it's hotter and you're not going to necessarily get into anything between that like 10 and 5:30
Hmm.
time frame. But that gives you a lot of time to cover ground and learn a lot. And I think a lot of that comes back to just like not worrying about blowing stuff up, which works better when you have more land to work with when you're on that's like public ground scouting and stuff. The past couple years I've been doing a decent amount of private land hunting. I do a lot of work on this farm, really good friend of mine down here. It's like a 100-acre farm. Just been doing a lot of habitat stuff, and I've been very interested in just watching how that affects the wildlife usage. So I've been hunting there a lot more too, and I feel like that's helped me learn a lot more small scale stuff. And like, you got to be a little more careful about where you're pushing into when you have less ground to work with. So you can't do as much of that like middle of the day, like I'm gonna run over there and check what that looks like. Because if you do bump something out of there, it might be on the neighbors for the following week or something, or just mess up movements a little more. You got to be a little more precise of doing your scouting like that. But you learn a lot more quickly when you have smaller acreage like that. But then when you get into the rut and stuff like that, ground hunting, you can just be really as aggressive as you want is the way I see it, especially if you're trying to just cover ground and check new places out. You got to be where the action is, anyways. So if you cover ground and you find like the hottest sign, there's a good chance, even if you do bump them, if you bump them or not bump them, they could just be in a totally different spot 500 yards away the next day. So I think ground hunting and covering ground just to find the deer in the rut, that's like the best move. And then obviously you can still do the same of like I found a scrape that has pee in it and it's torn up the past 3 days. You can still find those spots while you're covering ground and know setups that you can make. But the more ground you cover, the more you're gonna probably just bump into a buck with a doe and be like, okay, there he is, and be able to essentially track him, try to stay with him.
Is that just
But
like,
long-winded.
is that just like, you think just because obviously during the rut they have other things on their mind, they just have a shorter memory in a sense? Just kind
Yeah,
of
and
like they might think
I
something's
think
weird, but they move a little, the distance might not be as far.
Yeah, I think they're more tolerant to disturbance like that just because they're getting disturbed so much by younger bucks and everything anyways. And yeah, certainly they're more preoccupied by breeding than they are you being there, as opposed to when you're trying to slip into a scrape that's 80 yards from a bed that you presume is there in October, where you got to really take your time. You can just be more aggressive at that time of year, I think, and you're going to learn more.
And then, like early season, you kind of said that system works really well, the stage hunting one, maybe more middle of October starting when you're maybe have at least a starting point as far as some sign or a concentration of or bedding areas when you get later. Early season, is it more of like a observation first? Do you try to, or how does that?
Yeah, sometimes, and like I find it hard to. I guess the places I hunt, I don't really do many like I guess observation hunts to where you're like overlooking things. Where in a lot of other places you might have like big open CRP fields or like ag fields, and it's like I'm gonna stay back here 500 yards away and like observe what's going on movement wise. Whereas when you're in the timber, it's like you kind of got to be like right on where stuff's going on to like actually observe what's going on, especially like with like October buck movement. The typically only going like 60 to 100 yards on a within that window of like the evening or morning, something like that, within the daylight hours. So you kind of got to like find the hottest sign, especially in that early time frame when there's so little sign and you're finding the rub lines and stuff, the first ones that are popping up. I feel like that just gives you so much more confidence early in the season when it's like, oh, I'm not seeing much sign, but now all of a sudden I'm in the hot, I found a scrape and here's a rub line. You're probably pretty close to where the action is, so you can start picking it apart from
Yeah,
a smaller radius, essentially.
because it's kind of the same terrain here. Like I'm in southwestern Wisconsin, like the driftless area. So it's a lot of maybe a little bit smaller scale than where you're at, but it's kind of like the same thing. A lot of it's timber, a lot of it's hills, bluffs, and steeper ditches and stuff. And yeah, there's not a lot of areas where you can just sit and watch, even if like a swamp or a slough or anything like that. There's not much. And I think,
Especially early, so much
yeah,
vegetation that plays such a big part.
it's tough because like you go this time of year and you're like hanging cameras and stuff, and it seems like it's so thick, and it'd be hard to believe that in less than 2 months it's going to be completely bare. So I guess transitioning into maybe you kind of talked about your system as far as just like still hunting and staging through. What are like some things that you like to focus on more details in that? You kind of explained your overall system, but like, are you the little things you're thinking about are like wind? Are you just working with the wind in your face, or kind of how do you approach it?
Biggest one, like the thing that I think has clicked a little more for me in the past couple of years is like not worrying so much about getting in for like long sits for like an evening or something. For example, for an evening hunt, instead of trying to go in and you're like, I know this bulletproof spot, I'm going to get into it early. Instead, I've been like more so approaching it like I'm going to wait for the thermals to begin to fall or like the winds to just stop. A lot of times in October, it's just a light and variable. And when you have to get in close to bedding areas, the more time you spend within that spot, the more your wind is just moving around and pushing around. So a lot of it's more like I'm going to wait for the sun to get to this point of the hill, put the shade here, and then I can work with the thermal that starts to drop here, and then get to my setup with like an hour and a half of daylight left. Your thermals are already in your favor. You might have a couple of those like last gusts that are pushing it, but you're not sitting there for 2 hours with like all of a sudden you get that one wrong wind that pushes it into the wrong spot. So just looking at those fine movements of thermals, that's like the biggest thing that everyone always talks about, obviously in the hills, is the thermals, because that's by and large that's what the deer are absolutely using out here. Same goes for mornings when like you get on an east slope in the morning, the sun's going to hit it at a certain point, and all of a sudden the wind's going to start coming from the bottom, and it's consistent. way more consistent than any like wind that you're going to see on a forecast. So you can actually bank on this is what it's going to do, and that's that's how I killed a buck last year. Sitting on the ground was like get into this spot and know the thermals at 20 minutes after legal light. As soon as that sun breaks, like the hill that's right over here, it's going to hit this. Thermals will kick up. My wind will be good, and I know that like now the movement is coming from this direction. And a lot of times, deer will bucks especially as soon as that wind in the morning or evening is dropping or coming up, whatever, they'll just hit that wind tunnel, and like that's the move that they make. And a lot of times around here, you'll get like old gas roads and stuff that'll run those benches, and I think those are pretty killer spots, especially when they're within some type of cover and you hit that perfect time of morning. Even like last year when I killed mine, it was a really honestly a terrible weather morning. It was humid and warm, but it was within the perfect like strip of cover. The wind worked out perfectly. And it was just that scenario where I think you got to do a lot of that with ground hunting too. There's going to be a lot of times where you get into your spot and nothing happens because you can't see very much, but you have to keep kind of just hitting the right spots with the right conditions. And I think you can get away with that more when you're changing exactly where you're set up.
So you maybe have wind in the back of your head, but it's not thermals. You're definitely hunting the thermals in that like more micro time frame of the day.
You know, unless you get your strong predominant wind days, those are obviously very helpful. And a lot of times it'll be, you know, the wind's going to be 4 or 5 mile an hour out of the northwest, and you, wherever you're set up on your slope, when your thermal hits it, you're working with like your wind is kicking it this way when it gusts, but your thermals are taking it this way. It's a lot of like very fine movement. And I think most of the time when you're in like a kill spot, if you will, it's like I know this is where it's going to happen, and my wind is going like right here instead of wind in my face. Because usually when you're set up wind in your face, it's not set up well for the deer to be coming
Right.
to that spot. So you got to be like kind of risky with where you're putting your scent.
Yeah. It's not always ideal, but like that's what I was gonna say or before you kind of touched on it was wind, it seems like you only really have to focus on it when it's drastic one way or the other, like super windy or zero wind at all. That's when it makes a bigger difference. But usually, like you said, most of the year, most days, it's very marginal or very like mediocre anyways.
Way more influenced by the sun, where the sun's hitting, and how steep the slope is, and all that. Yeah.
Yeah. So those little things that you might overlook, just those little environmental factors, like you said, the sun and the thermals and stuff like that's more what you're focusing on. All right. So maybe what you kind of already started mentioning, why don't you do like a 5 minute synopsis on your buck last year and everything that went into
Uh-huh.
that?
Yeah, that one. So that one was like pretty interesting for me. I think it was like the first time so this one was on the same like private property where I've been doing a bunch of work, and I was able to like watch this buck a couple times in September. I don't really run cameras or anything. I have one old muddy camera that honestly like barely ever works, and I put it out for fun sometimes to see what's going on, but I was able to like see this buck, glassed him a couple times out in some hay fields around, and I knew that was like one of the bigger ones around. And then early in October, the black oak started dropping heavy last year, and there was one site of like heavy, a couple huge black oaks. A lot of doe activity was like pretty consistent in there early in October, and then right on like October 10th, all of a sudden the sign just like exploded in this spot, like huge rubs and ginormous scrapes, tons of huge scrapes. And it's like I know that the big one is coming up to this spot, and I'd seen him in late September, and just started kind of doing like what I was talking about, where less aggressively because it's a smaller property than like large public land areas, but just started sitting heavy at the sign in conditions where I knew that I could just get away with being there with the wind. Luckily, the access to like where the main feeding site was really easy. It was literally beside like someone's. So like my friend that lives there on the property, the house is right here, and then like the yard area. It's not really even yard, but pretty close to the house is where these huge oaks are. So every night those are coming out to that spot. So you're able to access into that, and you can hunt that feeding area almost like you're hunting the field to where you know deer are coming to this spot feeding consistently, and you can sit the scrapes, watch like where the does are coming from, which is very helpful to see where the heaviest doe trails are. You're able to see, okay, these are the consistent 3 or 4 doe bedding areas. And that kind of helped me start to see like I had learned from previous years too, like where the buck cruising trails are and how the bucks are approaching it differently. But you can see how they're using the terrain to put themselves like under the they'll come in under the feeding area in the evenings when the thermals are dropping from it and cut like the steep slope coming into this feeding area. So I started doing these different sets kind of off this almost cliff edge to where it's oaks above it to where all the feeding is going on. I started sitting this heavier trail down here. Sat it one evening and had the buck coming from like behind me, literally like ran in on me, ran by me at like 6 yards. Couldn't really get my bow or get him stopped, and he stopped like 30 yards from me, facing away. And I just like didn't do anything else at that point. Let him comfortably work off because at that point it's like, okay, I know where he's coming from, and if he didn't know I was there, it didn't really like spook him or anything. So then it ended up being 10 days later. I'm not sure if I even hunted right in that spot anymore between those days. Might have done one more evening or something, hot evening, and didn't see anything. And then I knew that where his cruising route was coming in on mornings and evenings. And there's this one spot where there's an X of really heavy trails, and it's right on this gas well road, like I was saying, that runs a really long east facing bench. Accessed up to that in a morning and just got set up to where I could shoot a scrape on where the trail that he was coming up one evening met up with this like big bench trail where I've seen a lot of morning movement, and just got into that spot and sat just facing exactly where I knew like with 90% confidence, like this is exactly where deer are going to be coming in from on morning movement. And just like literally sat there and watched it, and exactly how I pictured it happening. I had it set up to where I could see one scrape 25 yards from me probably, and then there was another scrape like 10 yards from me probably. That was the direction I knew they were coming from. So I knew I'd be able to see them at least hit the scrape potentially, or be walking down that trail through some cover, which gives me time to like draw my bow. And I looked up like through the cover, could see legs and scrape. Couldn't really tell like what the buck even was at all. But I got my bow and like drew as soon as I saw the deer turn. And he's walking through like pretty dense stuff within 20 yards at that point already. And I drew. And as soon as it got around the cover, I could see that it was like the big one. And it got out to like probably 10 yards right into my opening. And I was already drawn and everything and just shot, and it was perfect, which like brings up a lot of different things of planning your setups to know
Right.
like where where the traffic's coming from, and knowing your draw cover. That's a big one. And like my back cover was perfect on that. I had like overhead cover over top of me. It was a setup I had used at least once like the previous year. I had sat there a couple times in the past and not seen anything come past me at all. But I've seen so much traffic on there. I've seen so many scrapes. I knew that deer were coming through there. It's just a matter of being there at the right time, honestly.
Right. And we're going to dive into kind of based off of what you said about the factors of the setup once you actually get set up where you want to be. But before that, the one thing that just came to mind, that story that you were saying, when you're hunting that scrape and those intersecting trails, were you below that or above that?
I was like right on that plane because it's like steep and then it benches out, and that's where this gas well road was, and then it was steep again below that, and there was like a heavy trail coming up from the steep that hit that, and then obviously the trail that's running on the gas well road, and then there's even like additional ones that are cutting up. But I was like right on I was literally 10 yards from like the big crossing. I like to put myself dangerously close to stuff because it
Yeah.
just gives me the best shots. And then like if things mess up, it's still just a crazy hunt, and you don't have to deal with a 35-yard shot through the woods. I hate doing that. So I
Right.
like close quarters.
So when you get set up and you find that spot, are you basing like if what's your threshold as far as I need to be you find that spot where you need to be right here to maybe shoot a trail or shoot a scrape versus it's not ideal and I might have a small window, but the cover is there. Like what's your kind of thinking there?
I I think like a setup where if you can get into a setup and you're on a scrape, for example, where you know that's like the central spot, if that's your one shot and you have like all cover all around you, but you can comfortably draw to that and then you can like kind of see through the cover around you, I think that's better than being like, I guess that's better than being like farther away from it and knowing you have like better cover with maybe, or like the same cover with maybe a couple other options. Like I said, I like being right on top of spots like that and putting yourself on like one lane. I think it just helps you a lot more because like when you're on the ground, things can really sneak in on you. Like you gotta be on edge a lot because you don't have the aerial advantage of seeing stuff, and like hearing can even be a little bit harder. And when you're a little uncomfortable, sometimes you're moving around a little bit more. So as much cover as possible helps. And then like just knowing your exact lanes, even if they're a little bit small, I think is totally fine.
And I think I get hung up now, like I've ground hunted for years growing up, but it was more flat land. Now being in hill country, the elevation and the setups on the ground has been my hang up, I guess, per se, if you can call it that. You know, finding a spot or them going up and over like a pinch point in a ditch on the top side of it or something like that during the rut when they're cruising, finding like the spot you know you need to be or like a community scrape or something earlier in the year. But then you kind of like look around at your surroundings, like where can I get away with even shooting to this? But
Mhm.
then a lot of times that really, really, really great cover, like a blowdown or something that gives you like that horizontal cover or something is like puts you kind of in a bad spot. So I
Mhm.
guess that's been my biggest hang up. So it sounds like you're
Yeah.
saying maybe not having the best of the best cover, but having something to where you could see yourself getting away with it, but then for sure being able to shoot the spot you know you need to be able to shoot.
Yeah. And like, I guess maybe another one, maybe is even a different topic. Being able to shoot to like your downwind side is pretty helpful too, because a lot of times on the ground, if you do get kind of picked off and like a deer starts to circle you, like they'll stay within range and try to circle you downwind. And sometimes you'll be able to like, it's like, oh, I have this lane down here, here, and here. But then they get downwind you and you don't even have a lane there. That could be your last chance of shooting. And it gets weird in like open woods. I think sometimes you'll find a spot that's like, this looks great and I'd love to be set up here, but there's just not enough cover to get away with anything. And maybe you just push a little bit further and you just use that as your way of justifying, like, okay, I'm going to get more aggressive because this setup just doesn't work for me. So I'm going to push closer to maybe thicker bedding, and maybe you get into some thicker stuff and have better cover. And you're maybe way closer to, maybe you don't even see what's going to be coming out at you until it's 30 yards away, but you can hear something coming out, but you have better cover and you can shoot the same trail. Yeah, it gets tough in like open actual timber scenarios where you don't have breaks of old field reversion or stuff like that, which you get a lot of that around here. And I'm sure up by you, you might have just more open woods, field on top, or something like that. I don't know.
And I think it's something that I've learned too. You kind of touched on it a little bit there about you said getting right in, but I'm almost maybe inversely different. Like I have confidence in shooting a little bit further just because I practice a little bit further, but there's so
Yeah,
many factors that can go into cover wise, like hitting a stick you didn't see or just
yeah,
things like that that you got to consider. But I think people should really think about too. And you kind of said maybe thinking about a little bit, not necessarily always hunting super close, but like you said, I've learned to maybe hunt 40 or 50 yards downwind or away from that maybe destination per se, whether that's a scrape or a pinch. It might not seem as good in hindsight, but when you think about it, if that's the direction they're coming from, maybe sitting a little bit further away isn't a bad thing because I've had it where bucks will circle downwind first and come into it, or that's just something to keep in mind, I think, too. You can either get right on top of it and have a good setup that way, but that's not a big deal if not, because a lot of times, because like if you put a camera and set it on a community scrape all year, that deer, if he's close, might hit it once or twice a week, but you just have to assume that he's coming through there more than that, but it might just be downwind checking it or whatever.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people just don't think about that too.
Yeah, for sure.
I kind of want to just talk about maybe some specifics as far as your gear goes.
Thinking that.
Because I know I've switched things this year. I went to a shorter bow. I was shooting like a 34 inch. I went down to, I think it's 30 or 31. Something to think about as far when you're on the ground in tight quarters, moving it around, just catching it on stuff, even carrying it through the woods since a lot of your hunting's still hunting. Just like more of that than just catching on stuff. And then you get to your spot and you look down and there's stuff all in your cams and just rest or whatever.
And it's way lower profile when you're kneeling down and you're holding it, and that cam's only like in line with your head rather than being unicorn over your head when you're holding the bow. I think mine's a 28. I have the bare divergent is what I'm shooting still, and it's like I love that thing just because of that reason. I've always shot pretty short ATA bows, and like I'm pretty used to it. I've never shot the ones that are like pretty crazy and like way more stable, and that's what people I feel like always say is like, oh, they're hard to hold and they're less stable, and I'm sure they are, but I'm used to it, and I like having the shorter bow. It's just easier to move around with. Another thing that started using last year that made a huge difference is a bow stand. I just bought like a $9 one on Amazon, something like that, and I'll throw it in my pack. Sometimes I'll keep it on my bow, but I don't like always trust it to stay on there. But having that, something that it's definitely going to get caught in and make noise, you can clear your zone and then just have your bow sitting right in front of you to where your hand is just this much of a movement to get it up, grab your bow, and it's already right in front of you, and you can draw it from that position. That helped me in so many different setups, even just kind of practice drawing on stuff and having your bow ready immediately as soon as something comes in, where a lot of times in the past it's been like, oh, here's one, and you pick it up and it's caught on blackberry and greenbrier, and it dings and makes all those plastic and metal noises, and then immediately the deer's pegged onto you. That's a lot. And a lot of people have them, but
And like you said, you could buy them for $10, $20 on Amazon or Fleet Farm or wherever. And even putting it in a pocket or your pack and pulling it out. And once you're like in your setup and then throwing it on there takes 2 seconds.
Yeah, that's what I usually do. And like, I like to just travel pretty light when I'm ground hunting and just have like a pack with, I always like to have water on me. You can cover as much ground as you want. You got a day's worth of water and a rangefinder and binos. You cover ground.
I'm kind of the same way where I'm getting more minimalist and worry about that other stuff once you get one down. Like if I have to make 2 trips back to the truck, I don't really care. Like at that point.
You to walk later.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, I think you kind of brought it up a little bit too. I think it's really important for people that's just starting ground hunting to one minor thing that, I mean, most people probably do this without even thinking about it. But when you get to your spot, clearing the leaves out from around. So then, especially if don't have a tree seat or something, if you're on your knees or squatted down or sitting or something, just getting it so it's bare ground so that just those little movements, if you have to shift your weight and try to bend around some brush or something, it's not, because usually when you're doing that, when you're trying to draw, is when you get busted the most on the ground. There's the most movement, there's the most noise. So eliminating that noise first is, I think, important. And I've learned that recently too. And just making sure you can practice draw before, and be able to at least have somewhat of a quarter of your maybe radius that you could shoot. So that gives you a little bit better chance than.
Yeah, you nailed the one. Couple things I was thinking about there. The one, you can approach. You're trying to be less aggressive, like earlier in the fall. I'll do like the squirrel method, where you just kind of get your hands under the leaves and just slowly, just like it sounds a lot like a squirrel, and you can clear it. It'll take a couple minutes, but just being slower and always watching around you while you're doing it. And then later in the season, you can just get into, especially if you're doing shorter setups, just get in and make a mock scrape and just sit down and be extremely diligent watching for 10 minutes at least after you do something like that. But then,
Are
yeah,
you
practice drawing for sure. Knowing that, go ahead.
are you when you're doing that with the leaves and stuff, are you like later in the year incorporating grunting and rattling into that too, just to make it like just a more of a natural sound?
Yeah, I would say for sure, with especially when you're doing a scrape like that. Like, yeah, I guess that's one other thing I like to have at all times of year is just a grunt tube. It's just an easy thing you can do to like a realistic noise and just grunt while you're making, especially if you snap a stick on accident when you're walking around and maybe it's like, ooh, I didn't want to snap that one. It's a little too loud. Maybe you grunt a little bit, stop and listen. But yeah, definitely using realistic noises like that is going to help and maybe is enough to just bring a buck in at a weird time and you didn't expect, but you call him in while making your setup. That happens more than you would think, where you get into a spot and you're making a lot of natural sounding noise and not really knowing about it. And then you look up and it's like, oh, there he is. He's coming in. That's happened quite a few times, honestly.
And then, so we touched on kind of the bow setup, not having long stabilizers is something to think about too. I put a shorter one on this year as far as just drawing and be able to be a little bit more mobile with it. The last thing I kind of wanted to talk about was everybody kind of thinks ground hunting, they think camo or your silhouette. Like, do you run a ghillie suit? Or what's kind of like your camo or camouflaging setup, like face paint at the lowest level?
Yeah. So the past couple years, I'm pretty sure. Let's see. Last year, I was wearing gray pants and like an old '80s real tree like denim jacket, like faded, very not camo. I hunt in like I have a solid tan, like a neutral colored first light merino wool, like base layer that I wear so much in the fall. And it's so comfortable and I'll just straight up hunt in that. I personally think that if you have enough high quality cover, if you're wearing neutral tones, you can get away with quite a bit. The past couple years I've hunted in, yeah, just literally gray pants and some type of like maybe kind of camo top. But then you end up wearing like you got a vest on and binos and there's all these other things hanging off you anyways. Later in
Right.
the season, later in the season you need more cover for sure. But then I do have a leafy jacket. I wear it more for turkey hunting. It smells so bad, and like obviously you can clean it, but it just clings onto my smell a lot more than anything else I have, which I think is a big factor for deer hunting. I think it literally just creates this giant waft of scent that is going to be a lot more alarming than some other clothing that I have. And I don't know. I definitely could wear more camo, but I've gotten away with not, and it's
Sure.
fine. I think it's just up to whatever you want to wear. Face paint for sure, like you said. I think that's a really helpful thing. Face is the one thing that if you can cover up the solid color of that and just break it up some. I wear this hat, have for like the past couple of years, and if you have anything with a bill, you can put it down pretty low and have something covering your face like that, and be able to stay pretty still and blend in really well.
I think I would just recommend just stay away from the drastic things that have no breakup to them. Stay away from bright white. Like if your back cover is darker. And then if in most scenarios on the ground where there's lighter grasses or leaves or whatnot, and you don't have big trees breaking you up, stay away from like black and white. I feel like those two things, if it's anything in between with any sort of thing breaking it up anywhere, so that's like your skin, it appears white in the sun. So just putting something on it just to mat it down a little bit, I think is more than
Yeah,
enough.
neutral tones of like green and brown is like it works so well if you're in the right cover. Like it'll work if you're sitting still enough, I think.
All right. I'm trying to think of anything else I wanted to bring up before we wrap it up.
The one other thing I didn't mention that it's just a totally random thing, but for ground hunting, I think it gives you way more quality shots when you're shooting deer when you don't have that angle to account for. I've shot several deer with like very quartering to, extremely hard quartering to, or like straight frontal, and that's my favorite shot because I like being close quarters. If you're shooting a deer at 12 yards, quartering to or frontal, it's like you can plow it right through, especially if you're shooting the right broadheads and all that stuff. But yeah, you have the straight plane, so you can actually just put it on the vitals that you know are there, and not have to have the like thinking about your shots and stuff because it's always really fast when you're on the ground too. It's like I know my spot, got to get it, have the whole shoot, and you have to be able to
Right.
check those things off quicker.
It's like from a tree, if you have any sort of quarter to it, you have the quarter left and right and up and down, to where you're on the ground, you only have your left and right, your up and down should be the
Mhm.
same, because if you're on the same level as them. So it just eliminates the percentage that you're going to get a
Mhm.
deflection or go all the way through that animal on the same plane,
Yeah,
essentially. So yeah,
I
that's a good
think
point.
I think on the ground frontal shots is like the most lethal way that you can shoot an animal, in my opinion. It's deadly.
When we were talking about the movement portion and just making sure you're able to draw and stuff like that, what have you had luck with? The more people that I've talked to that have a lot of experience ground hunting is when that deer's so close, people like want to draw behind cover and you hold that full draw a long time before they get to you. Or I've heard people wait until they almost get past you and then you're not in their peripheral anymore. So they're almost kind of
Yeah.
past you already when you draw.
Yeah, which is dependent on setup. I like to set up in a way where I don't know. I guess it's tough to like be too picky and choosy with it, but to have some type of cover that you know the deer is going to be behind at some point, and then be able to draw at that point and have the shot in the lane. I think the closer the further cover away, and they have it closer to them in front of their draw cover. It is. It seems like. I guess I'd have to think about that more. Had it at least once before or whatever, but it seems like frequently now really right in front of me. And I was still hunting, a buck just came in. It was like, oh, I have nowhere to go, but I put a tree right in front of me and him, and I drew. It took me a little too long to get my draw motion, and he had already made it a little bit too far around, and then the tree wasn't in front of me anymore, and just didn't have any type of shot at all.
Right.
To where if you can have cover that you know they're going to go behind and give you that, it's tough. It's all, I mean, that's all extremely situational,
Yeah.
obviously.
I just think it comes down to just having that in the back of your mind that it could happen, to where like when you're practicing, be ready on the ground to either hold for a long time or be ready to be good enough in your shot and your mental game and practicing that you can draw back and shoot within 2 seconds, like either
Yeah.
super fast or super long, and just know that that's a very good possibility.
But definitely both, I would say. Being able to I shoot really low draw weight too. That's another thing. It's like 63 pounds, maybe something like that. So you can just draw the thing back like a toy and have it immediately drawn back. I think that helps a lot with that. And then, like you said, holding the draw. That's something Zach has. He'll send us Snapchats and stuff to try to keep us on our game of just practicing long draws. Just draw at your target and put a song on or something. Try to make it to the end of the song. Go for, I don't know, a minute plus, minute and a half. There's times, obviously, everyone's probably had something like that where you draw and it gets to 45 seconds and it's like, can't go anymore. I have to let down, and then it ruins it. Where if you can get another 15 seconds and let the thing come in and still be confident to shoot, I can make or
Right.
break it.
Yeah. All things to think about. But I'm going to be
Mm-hmm.
sensitive of your time. I know you got some work to do, so I appreciate you kind of diving in. I know we kind of touched on a lot of different things, and a lot of it you could go hours into just on itself on its
Mm-hmm.
own. So, but yeah, I appreciate your input on everything. Before you take off, just let everybody know that maybe wants to see some of your hunts. I know you got some out on YouTube, whether that's your channels or somebody else's. So, or let them know what your social channels are so they can follow along with you.
Yeah. I obviously do some stuff with THP, a lot of video stuff with them. I have Ohio Wild is kind of my business name. I do habitat and land management stuff as well. I really enjoy doing that stuff. Learn a lot about the land doing that as well. If you want to check me out, you can look me up. Yeah, had a great time talking about stuff. Gets me excited to start thinking about hunting season because I honestly haven't done a ton of that yet. But I would encourage people to experiment more with hunting on the ground because I think you learn a lot and you'll probably have a pretty cool, unforgettable experience at some point if you do it for long enough. So you got to keep doing it. You'll mess up plenty of times, but that's part of it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, like I said, I appreciate you hopping on. I'll let you get back to what you were doing, but have a good one.
Nice talking to you, man.